Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. I never thought house sitting could be dangerous. I mean, you're just watching someone's place, making sure nothing goes wrong while they're away. The Hendersons had been family friends for years, and when they asked me to watch their house in Flagstaff while they visited relatives in California for the holidays, it seemed like easy money. A week in December 2019, all alone in their beautiful suburban home. What could go wrong? The house sat on about 2 acres at the edge of town, surrounded by pine trees and winter silence. The nearest neighbor was at least a quarter mile away, which I actually liked at first. No noise, no distractions, just me and the peaceful Arizona winter. When Mrs. Henderson gave me the tour, she showed me where everything was. The thermostat, the spare linens, how to work their fancy coffee machine. She handed me a single house key and said, "This is the only copy we have with us, so don't lose it." I laughed and promised I'd take good care of everything. The first 2 days were perfect. I settled into their routine, made myself comfortable in their guest room, and enjoyed having a whole house to myself. December in Flagstaff gets dark early, and with the snow falling softly outside, it felt like being in a winter cabin retreat. I'd make dinner, watch Netflix on their big screen, and go to bed feeling completely relaxed. This was going to be the easiest job I'd ever had. Then came the third night. I was lying in bed around 2 a.m. when I heard them. Footsteps on the hardwood floors upstairs. Slow, deliberate footsteps, like someone walking carefully through the master bedroom. My first thought was that old houses settle, especially in winter weather. But these weren't settling sounds. These were the distinct sounds of someone walking. Step, step, step. Each footfall was measured, purposeful. I held my breath and listened as the footsteps moved from what I knew was the master bedroom toward the hallway, then seemed to stop right above where I was lying. My heart started pounding, but I tried to rationalize it. Houses make noise. Pipes expand and contract. Wood creaks. There had to be a logical explanation. The footsteps stopped, and eventually I fell back asleep. The next morning I convinced myself it had been nothing. But when I went to make coffee, I noticed muddy boot prints by the back door. Small puddles of melted snow and dirt, right there on Mrs. Henderson's pristine kitchen floor. I stared at them for a long time, trying to remember if I'd worn my boots inside the night before. I couldn't remember doing that, but I must have. I cleaned them up and pushed the thought away. The fourth night, I made sure to close all the kitchen cabinet doors before bed. I developed this habit of checking them, making sure everything looked neat and tidy for when the Hendersons returned. But when I came down for coffee the next morning, 3 cabinet doors were standing wide open, the ones above the counter where I'd specifically remembered closing them. That's when the feeling started. The feeling of being watched. It was strongest in the living room, especially near the large windows that faced the woods. I'd be watching TV and suddenly feel this overwhelming sensation that someone was looking at me from outside. The windows reflected my own image at night, but sometimes I'd catch myself thinking I saw movement in the darkness beyond the glass. When I'd get up to look, pressing my face against the cold window, I'd see nothing but snow-covered pine trees and shadows. By the 5th night, I'd had enough. I decided to stay awake and figure out what was going on. I positioned myself on the living room couch with a clear view of both the staircase and the front door, and I waited. Around 1:30 a.m. I heard it, the sound of a key turning in the front door lock. I froze. The Hendersons had given me the only key they had. I was holding it in my hand, but I was definitely hearing someone unlock the front door from the outside. The deadbolt turned with a soft click, and then I heard the door open slowly, carefully, like someone was trying not to make noise. My blood turned to ice. Someone was in the house. I heard the door close softly, then footsteps in the entryway. Slow, quiet footsteps on the hardwood floor. The same footsteps I'd been hearing upstairs. Someone was moving through the Hendersons' house, and they clearly knew the layout. The footsteps avoided the spots where the floor creaked, moved confidently through rooms I could barely navigate in the dark. I sat on that couch for what felt like hours, barely breathing, listening to someone move through the house below me and above me. Sometimes the footsteps would stop for long periods, and I'd wonder if whoever it was had left. Then they'd start again, soft and deliberate, like someone was searching for something. Or someone. I must have fallen asleep from sheer exhaustion sometime before dawn, because I woke up on the couch to sunlight streaming through the windows. The house was silent again, but when I got up to check the front door, I found it unlocked, and there were wet boot prints throughout the first floor, a completely different tread pattern from my shoes. Someone had definitely been in the house. That day, I seriously considered leaving early, but I'd committed to house-sitting for the full week, and I didn't want to let the Hendersons down with some story about imaginary intruders. Instead, I decided to get proof. On the 6th night, I downloaded a motion-activated recording app on my phone. I set it up in the living room where it could capture anyone moving through the main floor, then went upstairs to the guest room. If someone was getting into this house, I was going to have evidence. I woke up around 6 a.m. and immediately checked the recording. What I saw made my hands shake. The recording showed a shadowy figure moving through the house around 3 a.m. The image quality was poor in the darkness, but I could clearly see someone walking from room to room with complete familiarity. This person knew exactly where everything was, stepping carefully around furniture, avoiding the creaky spots I'd learned to navigate myself. But the most chilling part was when the figure stopped at the bottom of the staircase and just stood there for several minutes, motionless, as if listening for sounds from upstairs, as if listening for me. That was it. I packed my bags immediately, called Mrs. Henderson, and told her I had a family emergency and needed to leave a day early. She was understanding, told me not to worry about it, and said they'd be home that evening anyway. But before I left, I needed to know more. I drove to the neighbor's house down the road, an older man named Bill who I'd met briefly when I first arrived. When I told him what had been happening, his expression grew serious. "Yeah, they've had some trouble with break-ins," he said. "But here's the weird thing. Whoever was doing it seemed to have a key. No signs of forced entry, nothing broken, just someone who could walk right in." I felt sick. Did they call the police? They did. But without evidence of actual theft or damage, there wasn't much anyone could do. The Hendersons downplayed it, said maybe they'd forgotten to lock up a few times. When I told Mrs. Henderson about the break-ins later that evening, she seemed uncomfortable and dismissed my concerns. "Oh, Bill worries too much," she said. "We haven't had any real problems." But I noticed something when I drove by their house a week later. They'd installed a completely new deadbolt system with multiple locks. I never house-sat for them again. And sometimes, late at night in my own apartment, I think about that shadowy figure standing at the bottom of the staircase, listening. I think about how well they knew that house, how comfortable they were moving through those rooms in the dark. I think about the fact that they had a key. Working the night shift at a 24-hour laundromat sounds like the most boring job in the world, but when you're broke and need quick cash, you take what you can get. Lucky Wash sat alone on Highway 34, about 20 miles outside Lincoln, Nebraska. It was one of those places that existed purely for convenience. Truckers doing laundry between long hauls, shift workers from the nearby plants, and the occasional local who couldn't sleep and figured they might as well be productive. I started working there in the summer of 2021. The overnight shift ran from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., and it paid an extra $2 an hour. because nobody wanted to work those hours. My job was simple. Keep an eye on the machines, help customers if they needed change or had problems, and clean the place. Most nights I'd see maybe 5 or 6 people total. The building sat surrounded by cornfields, with nothing but darkness and the occasional semi-truck passing by on the highway. For the first couple weeks, I actually enjoyed it. There was something peaceful about being alone with the rhythmic sounds of washing machines and dryers, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, and classic rock playing softly from the radio behind the counter. I'd bring homework or a book. The time passed pretty quickly. Then he started showing up. It was my 3rd week on the job when I first noticed him. A middle-aged guy, maybe late 40s, always wearing the same faded denim jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He'd come in around 2 a.m., buy a coffee from the vending machine, and sit in the corner chair by the windows. But here's the thing. He never did any laundry. He'd just sit there, sipping his coffee, watching me work. At first, I thought maybe he was a trucker taking a break, but he never mentioned having a rig parked outside. When I'd glance over at him, he'd be staring directly at me with this intensity that made my skin crawl. Not in an obvious, creepy way, but like he was studying me, memorizing details. The chair he chose gave him a perfect view of both me behind the counter and the parking lot outside. I started to notice that whenever another customer came in, usually a trucker or someone from the overnight factory shift, he'd get up and leave immediately, like he was timing his visit specifically for when I was alone. "You work here every night?" he asked one evening, his voice flat and conversational. "Most nights," I replied, trying to sound casual while my instincts screamed that something was wrong. "That's a nice car you drive," he said, glancing toward the parking lot where my Honda Civic was parked under the single security light. "Red Honda, right?" I noticed it when I drove in. I hadn't told him what car I drove, and the parking lot was dark enough that you'd have to be specifically looking to identify vehicle details. A chill ran down my spine. "Yeah," I said simply, then busied myself with cleaning tasks to avoid further conversation. But he kept talking. "Must get lonely out here by yourself. Good thing you've got regulars like me to keep you company." If you're still listening, you probably enjoy stories like this. A like or a comment helps keep them alive. After that night, his visits became a regular thing. Every single night, usually between 2 and 3 a.m., he'd show up with the same routine. Buy coffee, sit in the corner, watch me. He started making comments about my schedule, mentioning that he'd noticed I worked Monday through Friday nights. He'd talk about the weather, the late-night customers, how unsafe it was for a young woman to work alone in such an isolated place. "You never know what kind of people are out there," he'd say, shaking his head with fake concern. "I worry about you being here by yourself." The worst part was that he started staying longer each visit. What began as 20-minute coffee breaks stretched to an hour, then 2 hours. He'd position himself where he could see everything. Me, the customers who came in, every car that pulled into the parking lot. I realized he wasn't just watching me. He was studying my entire environment, learning the patterns of when I was most vulnerable. One night, a regular customer named Dave, a trucker who stopped by twice a week, came in to do his laundry around 2:30 a.m. Usually, the coffee-drinking stranger would leave as soon as other customers arrived. But this time, he didn't leave. Instead, he got up and went to the bathroom, staying in there until Dave finished his laundry and left about an hour later. That's when I understood. He'd been timing his visits to study when I was completely alone, but now he was changing tactics. He was learning to hide when other people were around. When he came out of the bathroom after Dave left, he sat back down in his corner chair like nothing had happened. "Busy night," he said casually. I nodded, but my hands were shaking as I folded towels. Over the next few nights, his behavior escalated. He started making comments about my appearance. "That's a nice shirt," or "You look tired tonight," You should be more careful driving home when you're exhausted. He began asking personal questions about where I lived, whether I had roommates, what my schedule was like during the day. I like to look out for people, he'd say when I didn't answer. Keep an eye on things, you know? Make sure nothing bad happens to good people like you. The way he said, keep an eye on things, made my blood run cold. Then came the night that changed everything. It was a Thursday in late July, and the parking lot light had burned out earlier that evening. I'd called maintenance, but they wouldn't fix it until morning, so the area outside was darker than usual. The stranger arrived right on schedule, but something was different about his demeanor. He seemed more alert, more focused. Instead of his usual corner chair, he sat closer to the counter and he kept checking the parking lot through the windows every few minutes. Around 4 a.m., during the dead quiet hours when no customers usually came in, he suddenly stood up and walked toward me. "You need to lock those doors right now," he said, his voice low and urgent. I looked at him in confusion. "What?" "Lock the doors. Now and turn off the lights in the front." Before I could ask why, I saw headlights pulling into the parking lot. A dark sedan, moving slowly, like the driver was looking for something. The car stopped about 30 feet from the building, engine running, but no one got out. The stranger moved to the window, staying in the shadows, but watching the car intently. His whole body was tense, like he was ready for trouble. "Who is that?" I whispered. "Some people have been asking around town about the girl who works nights here," he said, never taking his eyes off the car. "Asking what time you work, whether you're here alone, what kind of car you drive." My heart stopped. What people? Wrong kind of people, the kind that hurt young women. We stood there in the darkened laundromat for what felt like forever, watching the car sit motionless in our parking lot. I could see the silhouette of at least 2 people inside, but couldn't make out any details. Finally, after about 20 minutes, the car slowly pulled away and disappeared down the highway. The stranger turned to me and pulled a piece of paper from his wallet. "This is my number," he said. "If those guys come back when I'm not here, you call me immediately. Don't hesitate. Don't try to handle it yourself. Just call." I took the paper with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. "Who are you?" "Someone who's been watching out for you," he said simply. Then he left. I quit the next day. I called my supervisor and told him I was done, effective immediately. When I explained what had happened, he seemed genuinely concerned and said I'd made the right choice. 2 weeks later, I saw a news story in the local paper. Police had arrested 2 men for stalking and attempting to assault female employees at various night shift businesses around Lincoln. The article mentioned that they'd been casing potential victims for weeks, learning their schedules and waiting for opportunities when the women would be alone and vulnerable. I never learned the stranger's real name, and I never called the number he gave me. But sometimes I think about that night, about how he'd been there every evening, watching not just me, but watching for me, about how he'd recognized danger that I hadn't even seen coming. I still don't know if he was a guardian angel or something else entirely. All I know is that when real predators finally showed up, he was the one standing between them and me. October storms in Salem, Oregon can be brutal. The wind whips through the valley, rain pounds everything sideways, and if you're unlucky, you lose power for hours or even days. I'd been living alone in my second-floor apartment for about 6 months when the storm of October 2022 hit, and I thought I was prepared. Candles, flashlight, enough food to last a few days if needed. Just another Pacific Northwest weather event. The power went out around 8 p.m. on a Tuesday night. 1 minute I was watching Netflix. The next minute, everything went dark and silent, except for the storm raging outside. Wind rattled my windows, and rain hammered the roof like bullets. I could hear tree branches scraping against the building, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of something metal banging repeatedly in the wind. My apartment complex was older, built in the 1970s with about 12 units spread across 3 floors. Most of my neighbors were quiet, working professionals who kept to themselves. I'd maybe seen half of them in passing, exchanged polite nods in the hallway, but didn't really know anyone. It was the kind of place where people minded their own business, which I'd always appreciated. Using my phone's flashlight, I found my candles and got them lit around the living room. The flickering light created dancing shadows on the walls, and the whole atmosphere felt cozy rather than scary. I figured the power would be back on within a few hours, so I settled in with a book and waited. Around 10 p.m., I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment. That wasn't unusual. People lived here. People walked around. But with the power out and the building completely dark, it seemed odd that someone would be wandering the halls. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, like someone was walking carefully in the darkness. They moved from one end of the hallway to the other, then stopped, right outside my door. I set down my book and listened. Through the thin apartment door, I could hear someone standing in the hallway just a few feet away. They weren't moving, weren't knocking, just standing there. I could see the shadow of feet blocking the thin line of light that usually came from under the door, but with the hallway lights out, that line was black anyway. After what felt like 5 minutes, the footsteps moved away, continuing down the hall toward the stairwell. I tried to go back to reading, but the cozy atmosphere had changed. Every small sound seemed amplified. The building settling, the storm outside, the occasional creak of footsteps somewhere in the complex. About an hour later, I heard the hallway footsteps again. This time, I paid closer attention. The footsteps moved slowly down the hall, pausing at each apartment door. Not just walking past, but stopping at each one for several seconds before moving on. When they reached my door, they stopped again. The silence stretched on, and I found myself holding my breath. Then I heard something that made my skin crawl, the soft sound of my door handle being turned. Someone was testing to see if my door was locked. The handle moved slowly, carefully, like someone was trying not to make noise. I heard the mechanism click softly as it turned, then stopped when it met the resistance of the deadbolt. The person trying my door handle held it there for a moment, then slowly released it. The footsteps moved on to the next apartment. I sat in my candlelit living room, heart pounding as I realized someone was systematically checking every apartment door in the building to see which ones were unlocked. During a power outage, in the middle of the night, I grabbed my phone to call 911, but the cell service was spotty due to the storm. I could barely get 1 bar, and when I tried to make the call, it wouldn't go through. I was completely on my own. Around midnight, the pattern became more obvious. Every hour or so, the mysterious person would walk through the hallways, testing door handles. I started paying attention to the sounds from other parts of the building. Creaking floors above me, the distant sound of doors opening and closing, footsteps on the stairs. Then, around 2 a.m., I heard a loud crash from somewhere above me. It sounded like furniture being overturned or someone falling hard onto the floor. The crash was followed by silence, then by footsteps moving quickly across the ceiling. Heavy footsteps like someone running or moving frantically through the apartment directly above mine. The hallway footsteps started again, but this time they were more frequent, more urgent. Whoever was out there was no longer just casually checking doors. They were moving with purpose, and I could hear what sounded like keys jingling softly in the darkness. Keys. Someone had keys to the apartments. I pressed myself against the wall next to my front door, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The footsteps approached my apartment again, and once again, I heard my door handle being tested. But this time, after the handle, I heard the distinct sound of keys. Someone was trying to unlock my door. I heard different keys being tried in the lock, soft metallic sounds as each one was inserted and turned. My door had 2 locks, the handle lock and a deadbolt. and I listened in terror as someone worked methodically to get through both of them. The first lock clicked open. Now they were working on the deadbolt. Key after key, trying to find the right one. I realized I was holding my breath again, terrified that any sound might alert the person outside that I was awake and listening. Then, through my door, I heard a whisper, "I know you're awake in there." The voice was male, low and calm, like someone having a normal conversation, but there was something wrong with the tone, too casual for someone breaking into apartments in the middle of the night. I grabbed my phone and tried 911 again. This time, the call went through, but the connection was terrible. I whispered my address to the dispatcher and tried to explain what was happening, but the call kept cutting out. I wasn't sure if they understood the situation or would even be able to respond during the storm. The key trying stopped. The footsteps moved away from my door, but I could still hear movement in the hallway. Whoever was out there was still active, still going through the building. Around 5 a.m., the power suddenly came back on. Hallway lights flooded under my door, the building's heating system hummed back to life, and my digital clocks started blinking. I immediately looked through my peephole, expecting to see someone in the hallway. It was empty. But several apartment doors were standing ajar, including the one directly across from mine. I spent the rest of the night awake, sitting by my front door with a kitchen knife in my hand, waiting for daylight. The next morning, I learned what had happened. Police cars filled the parking lot, and I discovered that the building's maintenance worker had been fired 3 weeks earlier for stealing from apartments. But apparently, he'd kept copies of all the keys. They found him passed out drunk in one of the vacant units upstairs, the source of the crashing sound I'd heard. He'd been using the power outage as an opportunity to go through apartments, taking whatever he could find in the darkness. The other tenants who'd had their doors standing open had been robbed while they slept. My deadbolt had saved me. If I'd only had the handle lock like some of the other apartments, he would have gotten in. The police officer who took my statement said something that still haunts me. "You're lucky you were awake. He's done this before during power outages in other complexes. Usually people sleep right through it." I moved out of that apartment complex a month later, but I still think about that night whenever the power goes out. About the sound of keys trying to find the right fit, about the whispered voice saying he knew I was awake, about how darkness can turn the most ordinary places into hunting grounds for people who know exactly what they're looking for. Now, when storms knock out the power, I don't just check my locks. I stay awake and listen. Because sometimes the most terrifying thing about being home alone isn't what might be outside trying to get in. It's realizing that someone already has the keys. Some say these experiences ended those nights, but I still wake up sometimes, listening for footsteps in hallways that should be empty, checking locks that should be secure. They say your home is supposed to be your safe place, but now I know better. Sometimes the most dangerous moments come when you think you're completely alone, when you discover you never really were. Thanks for listening if you made it through the darkness.